Welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into the mind, the man, the mystery that is Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. We've debated whether his positions on taxes, spending, and economics set him apart from the Republican field. What about foreign policy? He's for tripling the border patrol, against the president's deal with Iran, and very proud of his legislation, quote, to prevent known terrorists from entering the U.S. as ambassadors to the United Nations. That last one passed unanimously. Even President Obama must be against terrorist ambassadors because he signed it into law. As for the rest, does he have any more of a plan than the current president, who he's constantly criticizing? Anders?
Well, Ted Cruz is playing his foreign policy cards very close to his chest. The only thing that really sets him apart on a foreign policy level is his strong support of Israel. There's a lot of support for Israel.
Sets him apart from the current president or from
just
the Republican
generally
field?
from the foreign policy establishment. Okay. Is his strong support for Israel, including sanctions. He was strongly against sanctions against Israel during the 2014 Gaza war. He tries to, the only other thing that really sets him apart is his positions on immigration, which technically aren't even fully a foreign policy issue, although he's trying to fold it in.
It's a bridge, yeah.
It's a bridge.
Yep.
He's trying to fold it into his foreign policy just because he knows, I think, that he's got a weak foreign policy slate. The other stuff that he's talked about in terms of foreign policy, against terrorism, well, everyone's against terrorism. For sovereignty, everyone's for sovereignty. Mm-hmm. For the Constitution, everyone's for the Constitution. So I think that he's saying very little really on foreign policy.
Okay, on Israel, you mentioned that he's distinguishing himself on that. Not as much as Marco Rubio, who was willing to scuttle the deal with Iran over an amendment proposed to require any agreement with Iran to force Iran to recognize the state of Israel's right to exist.
He's strongly critical of Iran. I don't think you could get a more stronger person against Iran.
As well,
he's against he's for sanctions, continued sanctions on Iran. He's against the Iran deal, which I think is smart. I'm against the Iran deal too.
He got in big trouble for his support of Israel recently too, though. And speaking at in defense of Christians event to talk about Christians in the Middle East who are being targeted for their religion, and they didn't like what he had to say. I mean, I think the unequivocal support for Israel's policies is not just anti, insurgent terrorist Muslim, but just anti, everybody, and the Christians are caught up in that as well. And he was booed, and when he was, accused the people in the room of basically
it was an anti-Israel crowd.
Well, but you could be anti-Israel without
booed.
being an anti-Semite. You could be anti-Israeli policies. You can certainly be against their indiscriminate attacks on the people of Gaza and the West Bank. So he had to come back and apologize for that. Is the point? Is that he basically sort of, and it's an interesting point because I think it's one of the only times he's sort of lost it. Every other time he's a tremendous debater. This is his history from law school and everything else. I mean, he was a national champion. So he's very, very good at controlling himself. So he always sounds like he's on point and sticks with his points. I don't know how much of that is actually true. No, I think it's hard to tell what he really believes. But that was a rare time where Ted Cruz actually had to go back and apologize.
Is he getting tired of apologizing? Is that why he's trying to give himself some wiggle room on foreign
policy? He never apologizes.
Policy?
This is the only time he apologized. When else has he apologized for anything?
Look at what he said about John Kerry during the 2004 election. He said he was coddling dictators for his policies in the Middle East. And now, fast forward 10 years, he's himself a presidential contender. He's saying that we cannot tell friend from foe in the Middle East. Really, we should be trying to take out the bad guys. Oh, but wait, really, we don't know who they are. Where does he stand right now?
Actually, I think that's a fairly accurate assessment of how screwed up the Middle East is. I mean, it was easy.
But it's not a foreign policy.
It was easier to tell who the enemy was when it was Saddam Hussein, and right now people can barely keep...
Except when he wasn't our enemy.
Consistent.
When we armed him to fight Iran the first time, then he wasn't our enemy.
And whereas it's much harder to keep track of the factions in Syria, and I don't think any sane person looking at the factions in Syria would say, hey, let's leap into the middle of that.
So he's not giving himself wiggle room. He's actually just reacting to a different reality on the ground, 2004 versus
or John
today.
McCain. I think it ought to be a time for still greater
and
caution.
Lindsey Graham and many of the Republican establishment absolutely want boots on the ground in Syria and in Iraq.
But a staunch pro-Israel stance is in a way intervening in the Middle East.
Yes.
It is perpetuating a problem. To not address that
But
there are
that's
issues
not
in
that's
Israel.
not him. He does not want to intervene with boots on the ground. I think very few people want to intervene right now with boots on the ground after Iraq and Afghanistan.
How does it make him different from the other Republican contenders is the question.
Doesn't.
It doesn't,
Well,
right?
he's oddly. I mean, the centrality of Israel is very odd, right? When you read his website on foreign policy, he's got Israel front and center, and then he's got other Israel issues.
Maybe he's looking for Sheldon
Iran,
Adelson
the
to fund
Iran
him.
issue, the ISIS issue. You know, he's covering a lot of issues that are important to Israel, and he's covering Israel, but he's covering very little else. And there's so much else in the world to cover, including Russia, China, cyber terrorism. I mean, there's a ton of stuff out there to talk about.
To Melody's point about Sheldon Adelson, is this Ted Cruz trying to coddle up for his dollars and his support, or is this actually a long-standing, lifelong commitment to a religious issue for him?
I don't know. He made a joke about having, you know, all of his ancestry. His father's Cuban, his mother's Irish and Scots, I think, and he, you know, and Italian. So all of his background would lead one to think he should be Catholic, and he ends up a Southern Baptist.
Right.
So I don't know. I think he's really hard to read. I think he's clearly a highly intelligent man, and I think it's all a game for him. You know, I can't help but. Everything he says is so calculated, and the fact that you brought up that he's literally been a senator for 2 years. He did a lot of litigation with the Supreme Court before, but that's the extent of his experience. And I think he loves the sound of his own voice. And so I don't believe that the unequivocal support of Israel, no matter what they do, can really be a religious thing. I think there's something else involved there, because Anders is right. There's a much bigger foreign policy game out there that he hasn't addressed at all. And it could be just a raw appeal to the base, you know, the conservative Christians that support Israel because they want, you know, they're waiting for Armageddon. Can't have that till Israel reaches its biblical borders. But I just don't believe anything the man says.
Actually, the Republicans, because they've been more strongly supportive of Israel in terms of the Gaza war, and they were more strongly in support of Israel over the Iran sanctions. I think that the Republicans in general are actually trying to grab Democratic votes from the Jewish voter base. And the Jewish voter base has traditionally been pro-democratic, and I think Republicans during this presidential cycle will seek to change that.
The majority still are. The majority of the Jewish vote is Democratic, it is progressive, it's liberal. And there's a lot of Jewish Americans who strongly disagree with Israeli policy on many things. You know, but the other problem is you cannot even begin to have a debate about the policy, and Heather's absolutely right, is it is an underlying issue that our unequivocal, unquestioning support for Israel. Israel is not a democracy, and I'm so tired of hearing every politician say, oh, they're the only democracy in the Middle East, and they're not. It's not even close. So the Republican support for Israel, I think, is more about the base. They may be trying to peel off a few votes, but I think it's more about appealing to the far-right Christian base, the fundamentalists who just want to, you know, whether they believe it or not, I think maybe a few of them do, but it's really that dog whistle to the base.
Anders, respond, Israel, not really a democracy.
They treat their Palestinians unequally, and so to the extent that they treat the Palestinians unequally, it's definitely not a democracy. In the West Bank, it's not a democracy. In Gaza Strip, the West Bank is controlled militarily, the borders, by Israel. Yet the Palestinian citizens can't vote in Israeli elections. There's some fundamental problem.
And even
there.
Arab citizens of Israel, only some of them can vote. And this is the larger question that always comes back to. If they were to become a true democracy, there are more Arabs than Jews, and they would lose. Also, many of their laws are based in their religion. They are a theocracy to a certain extent.
There aren't more Arabs than Jews now.
In the larger
in
land
Israel
right?
itself.
Yes, not in Israel proper, but if they were to extend that. if they were to take over the entire area, as many people want, they would have to exclude anyone who is not Jewish living there, or they would be outvoted.
Melody, would Hillary Clinton hold Israel's feet to the fire more on any of these issues?
I don't know if any politician at this point in time can. Maybe Bernie Sanders might be able
Obama
to, but
did actually hold
it's my
Israel's feet to the
biggest- my
fire
biggest-
a bit more than
and it was
any
and
other
right, and
you
they
know,
laughed
president
at
in the
him,
past.
and they laughed at him, and nobody's willing to go to the logical extent of saying that we will defund you, we will stop doing things. They laughed at him and they got away with it. The invite by John Boehner to bring Netanyahu before the Congress was a huge insult, and it's it's gone. It's people who felt they had to go, certain Jewish Congress people, or they would be labeled as anti-Israel, even though they're Jewish. It's a mess. It's a real mess. And we have conveniently ignored that for the last 40 years.
Todd, we're saying that what we're hearing is that all the politicians, Democrat, Republican, are going to have the same stance on Israel. Will Rand Paul ask different questions of his fellow candidates during the Republican primary debates?
I think his attitude, somewhat like his father's, is more let Israel do its own thing, let it solve its own problems. So instead of treating it like it's a proxy for the U.S., let it do what it needs to do, even if that means, say, bombing Iranian nuclear reactors or something, the way Israel did Iraqi nuclear facilities back in 1980, which Ron Paul supported when all of Congress and Ronald Reagan were against the idea. I think both Pauls would tend to err on the side of respecting other nations' right to decide their own fates and avoid trying to get the U.S. more entangled. He tried to say, end all foreign aid, thinking that would sound even-handed, especially since we give more money to Israel's enemies than we do to Israel. But for a lot of people, that still sets off alarm bells. They're like, wait, that means cutting off foreign aid to Israel, even though there are countless other countries in the world.
If you want to let Israel control, have its own foreign policy and bomb who it will, let's stop paying for its military.
Right,
They
$10 billion
get
a year.
twice the amount of foreign aid that the next country gets, which is Egypt, because of the Camp David Accord, which is the only lasting peace in the Middle East negotiated by Jimmy Carter, who gets laughed out of the arena because
he is
has
history's
And let
greatest
them
monster.
declare
Tries to
their
speak
nuclear
some
weapons.
sense.
Let us know how many nuclear weapons Israel has. They're not a signatory to the nuclear arms
But I think
treaty.
that's
And they get away with it, right? And this is always, when you let religion enter politics, this is what you get. This stew of ridiculousness.
Melody, is it going to be good to have this debate, and will Ted Cruz make it necessary to have this debate during the election cycle in a way that we haven't in the past?
We're not going to have it. If we didn't have the debate when Netanyahu came before Congress, bypassed Obama, how are we ever going to have a debate about this?
I think we
don't
could have
understand.
debate because I think Hillary Clinton might be a little tougher on Israel than someone like Ted Cruz. And I think Ted Cruz is going to try to bring that up during the election. Let's say Ted Cruz were the nominee. I think he would try to bring it up during the election and pigeonhole Hillary Clinton with her lack of support for Israel.
I think until the American Jewish community, and there are many on the liberal side, J Street and all of that, until they have a national voice, until they say what they're saying behind closed doors out in public, I think it's impossible for any American politician that gets tough on Israel is going to they're going to be labeled anti-Semitic. There's going to be a huge outcry. Unfortunately, much of the populace doesn't really follow these issues, so they won't know what the intricacies of it are. And I think until American Jews themselves take a much more public stance, because many of them showed up for the Netanyahu.
So did it compare with IPAC, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
By the way,
last word, Todd.
Instead of, just for a moment, if we're talking about marginal groups being picked on, I think it's worth noting that a couple of people have apologized to Ted Cruz just in the last few days in the news, including the gay hotel owner who basically said, I don't know why all the gays are now boycotting me simply because we hosted a Ted Cruz event here at the hotel. My apologies to Ted Cruz and company for the overreaction by the
Isn't that like the
gay
guy who got
community.
shot by Dick Cheney apologizing for the embarrassment he caused?
Yeah.
No. And more importantly, Bloomberg News' Mark Halperin apologized to Ted Cruz for one of the most embarrassing interviews of all time, where Mark Halperin didn't seem to believe Ted Cruz was Hispanic because he's conservative and kept urging him to speak in Spanish and even to say hello in Spanish to Bernie Sanders and
What's his
welcome to the
favorite kind of
race.
taco?
What was that?
Our very next subject, Todd. That's our panel's view of Senator Ted Cruz, global statesman. When we come back, the senator's views on social issues and whether they will help him or hurt him in his race for the White House. Stick with The Run.